At 11:59 p.m. on June 30th, 2026, the U.S. Secretary of Energy signed two emergency orders that most Americans will never hear about, using a legal power that's supposed to be a last resort, not a monthly routine. One order let power plants across 13 states ignore their own pollution limits. The other gave a grid operator the authority to order data centers, some of the largest electricity consumers on the planet, to switch off the public grid within 15 minutes of a signal or be cut off entirely. Both orders were aimed at the same target, keeping a single power grid from breaking a record that had stood for 20 years. That grid is called PJM. If you've never heard of it, that's by design. It doesn't sell you electricity directly, and it doesn't put its name on a bill. It just quietly balances supply and demand for 67 million people across 13 states and Washington, D.C., making it the largest wholesale electricity market on the planet. And on July 2nd, 2026, PJM's own forecast said demand would hit 166,147 megawatts. The all-time record, set back in 2006, was 165,563. For 20 years, nobody came close. This time, the forecast said the record wouldn't just be challenged. It would be broken. Here's the part that should bother you. The emergency orders that just kept the lights on weren't a one-time reaction to one freak heat wave. They were the sixth time in 6 months that the federal government had to reach for this exact power to keep PJM standing. And the agency running the numbers on what happens next has already put a date on when this stops being an emergency and starts being the new normal. To understand why breaking a 20-year-old record isn't a triumph, and why the fix this time was borrowed emergency power instead of a real solution, you have to understand what PJM actually is and why the tool the government just used exists in the first place. PJM Interconnection isn't a power company. It's a regional transmission organization, essentially an air traffic controller for electricity, coordinating the flow of power across Delaware, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Maryland, Michigan, New Jersey, North Carolina, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia, and D.C. It doesn't generate power, and it doesn't own power plants. Its entire job is making sure that at every second of every day, the electricity being generated across that footprint matches the electricity being consumed, because the grid has almost no room for error. Supply and demand have to balance in real time, or voltage drops, equipment trips offline, and outages cascade. To manage that balance, PJM runs a 3-level alert system called an Energy Emergency Alert, or EEA. EEA 1 means reserves are getting low, a yellow light. EEA 2 means the operator is actively deploying emergency resources, an orange light. EEA 3 means the grid may need to start firm load interruptions, what most people call rolling blackouts, deliberately cutting power to specific neighborhoods on rotation so the entire system doesn't collapse at once. Think of it as a hospital's triage system for electricity. Nobody wants to reach the point where doctors start deciding who gets treated first. The entire design of the system, the entire point of the emergency orders signed on June 30th, is to do everything possible before you ever reach that final stage. Those emergency orders came from something called Section 202C of the Federal Power Act, a provision that lets the Secretary of Energy override normal market rules and environmental limits during a reliability crisis. It's meant to be the tool you reach for in a genuine emergency, not a lever you pull every few weeks. On June 30th, Secretary Chris Wright used it to authorize two things at once. First, an order letting PJM direct any data center or large facility drawing at least 50 megawatts of power, hospitals, 911 centers, water treatment plants, and defense sites were exempted, to disconnect from the public grid and switch to its own backup generators within 15 minutes of an emergency signal, freeing up capacity for homes and businesses. Second, an order letting power plants run flat out, temporarily ignoring the sulfur dioxide and nitrogen oxide limits that normally cap their output. Maintaining affordable, reliable, and secure power in the PJM service territory is non-negotiable, Wright said when the orders were announced. Both orders expired at 11:59 p.m. on July 3rd. Both were explicitly described as measures of last resort, the step taken specifically to avoid voltage reductions or rolling blackouts. In other words, The government didn't intervene because PJM's grid failed. It intervened because letting it fail wasn't an option, and doing nothing meant risking exactly that. That single sentence is the hinge this whole story turns on. If the fix here required emergency federal power, ignoring pollution limits, and ordering some of the largest electricity users in the country to unplug from the grid entirely, then the 20-year-old record that fell on July 2nd wasn't really broken by a wave of extra demand nobody saw coming. It was broken by a grid that no longer has the slack it used to have to absorb an ordinary hot week. And the timeline proves this wasn't a one-time surprise. It's a pattern, and it's sitting in public federal records with dates attached. The June 30th orders were the sixth time in 2026 that the Department of Energy reached for Section 202(c) authority to keep PJM's lights on. In January, during Winter Storm Fern, the department issued back-to-back orders, first letting generators exceed pollution limits, then authorizing the same kind of data center curtailment used in June, then extending that order because the storm hadn't let up. In May, months before anyone expects a heat emergency, the department issued another order curtailing data centers during what officials called an unseasonable heat wave, followed days later by an order keeping an aging power plant in Pennsylvania online through the end of August specifically because PJM couldn't afford to lose it. 6 declared emergencies in 6 months, covering a winter storm, an out-of-season heat wave, and now a record-breaking summer peak. A tool meant for rare crises had become something PJM was reaching for on what was starting to look like a monthly basis. 2 weeks before any of that, the pattern had already reached the people who were supposed to be watching it most closely. On January 16, 2026, the federal government and all 13 of PJM's state governors, a bipartisan group spanning states that agree on almost nothing else, jointly called on PJM to hold an emergency capacity auction by September 2026. When officials representing 13 different states, of different parties, with different energy policies, all sign onto the same emergency demand, that's not routine political noise. That's every governor in the footprint independently arriving at the same read on the data. PJM doesn't have enough generating capacity lined up for what's coming, and normal planning timelines aren't fast enough to fix it. If this were happening in isolation, in one grid, during one unusually hot summer, you could write it off as bad luck meeting bad timing. It isn't isolated. 600 miles west, the neighboring grid was already living through its own version of the exact same problem, a year ahead of PJM's record-breaking July. MISO, the Mid-Continent Independent System Operator, manages the wholesale grid across a swath of the Midwest bordering PJM's territory. Over the summer of 2025, MISO issued grid alerts on 40 of the 69 days between June 11th and August 18th. That's not a rough patch. That's an alert active on more than half of an entire summer. Different operator, different footprint, same root cause. Aging coal and natural gas plants retiring faster than new generation is being built to replace them, while demand from electrification and, increasingly, data centers climbs faster than anyone modeled just a few years ago. 2 of the largest grid operators in the country, sitting side by side on the map, both burning through their emergency playbooks in back-to-back years. Which raises the question this entire story has been circling. If PJM needed federal emergency powers 6 times in 6 months just to get through 2026, and its neighbor spent more than half of last summer under alert, what happens when the emergency tools run out? PJM has already answered that question itself, on the record. The organization's own forecasts show electricity supply falling short of the required reserve margin for the period running from June 2027 to May 2028, driven by the same forces on display all year. Power plants retiring faster than replacements are being built, and demand climbing faster than either. The North American Electric Reliability Corporation, the industry's own reliability watchdog, has independently flagged PJM as facing elevated risk of energy shortfalls over the next 5 years. This isn't a worst-case hypothetical buried in a footnote. It's the baseline projection from the people whose entire job is making sure the lights stay on for 67 million people. That's what makes July 2 Indy's broken record different from an ordinary hot day making headlines. Every previous record on this grid, including the one set in 2006, got broken because demand grew. This one got broken because the emergency tools built to prevent exactly this outcome are now the only things standing between a routine summer afternoon and a controlled blackout, and the agency running the numbers has already told you, in writing, that the gap is scheduled to get worse before anyone builds their way out of it. For 20 years, breaking this record required a genuine surprise. This time, it required borrowed emergency powers just to keep the record from breaking somewhere far more painful than a headline.